Goldeneye is one of the games that I remember most for its multiplayer mode. The game was huge in the late 90s, and it was one of the games that my friends and I played just constantly, especially whenever we went over to somebody's house, just to play games on the weekend or like Friday, Saturday night, that sort of thing. We played this a lot. And, before reading this book, I didn't know much about the game's development, and honestly, I didn't know much about the James Bond video games either. Alyse does an excellent job of kind of weaving the experiences of herself and other people into the narrative that she's kind of writing out here. And yeah, it's a great way to sort of experience this whole story. And, you hear a lot about the relationships with Nintendo and, kind of what happened with Rare after Microsoft bought it. It wasn't the focus of the book, so I understand why it wasn't really covered in detail, but I still found it very interesting. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about the book. One of the more interesting things in this book is just how Rare changed over the years. Like many stories that I've read about British developers from the 80s and even into the 90s, was how they started programming on the ZX Spectrum or BBC Micro or some of the other kind of smaller computers, and then eventually kind of moved out from there. Usually they would work in like this cottage industry of developers that sort of developed around that developed around sort of the British microcomputer scene, which was way bigger than it ever was in the United States. It's one thing that gets lost sometimes when you talk about video game history, especially for someone like me. I've got a very North American-centric view of it. The version of Rare from really like the 80s and everything kind of disappeared after the Stamper brothers sold the company, or at least sold part of the company to Microsoft. And that's getting a little bit weird, but so they had an original company which was programming games. They sold that company and then started a new one which would eventually become Rare. From there, they got really heavily invested into the NES and kind of working with several publishers. This is where I kind of differ a little bit from what Alyse said, because a lot of the games that Rare made on the NES were really not that great. You could see that there were some good ideas in them, but they were not very good, especially the licensed titles that they made. Because they made some titles for LJN that were not very good. They made Battletoads, which I have a lot of nostalgic memories for Battletoads, but going back and revisiting it, it's not as good as it probably was back then. However, they did do enough to kind of get on Nintendo's radar, because they were one of the first they were the first Western third-party developer, and later they became one of the first second-party developers for Nintendo. So Nintendo bought a little bit less than half of the company, and they kind of took Rare on, because Rare had shown that they were able to really make games that were much better than other companies out there, at least from like a side-scrolling action type of a game, which was pretty popular back then. So yeah, and then they became a huge part of the N64's library, and that's really, at least in my opinion, when they started making really, really good games. They made the Donkey Kong Country games on the N60 or on the SNES. Those were very good, but then they really kind of came into their own with the N64. A pretty cool thing that I found out from reading this was that Rare was offered the Goldeneye game, and they initially refused it because they just didn't really want to do it. It was then picked up by the team that did want to, that was part of Rare. and they were given like a very broad contract, which allowed them to do a lot with the property. They could take from the previous Bond movies. They didn't have to stick with just Goldeneye, and they were allowed to do just a ton of different things with it. The game would obviously go on to make Rare an awful lot of money as well, so it all worked out in the end. Around the time of Goldeneye, this is kind of when there was like an attitude shift at Rare, and we start hearing more about money from them, and we start hearing more about compensation for the developers' work. It feels like this just gets repeated a lot, where you have the developers that make a really hit game that makes the company a lot of money, and the company doesn't want to reward the developers for what they did, so they don't get fair compensation for what they actually did for the company. And this seemed to happen quite a bit, especially with GoldenEye. And you also have some of their internal development teams kind of not really liking the fact that this small team of kind of inexperienced developers, or junior developers, I probably should say, that they made something much more successful than what some of the other people had done. So you had a lot of jealousy and infighting and everything. I've read this story so many times, just the company names and the people's names change, and that was kind of fun and strange to see this around the same time. You also hear a lot about the freedom that Nintendo gave Rare, especially with GoldenEye. They were allowed to kind of just do anything, and the management really protected the development teams from any pressure from Nintendo. And then Nintendo sold their share of Rare to Microsoft, and everything just kind of shifted. And as I understood it from what I read in this book, they just kind of changed the whole attitude, and it became like less of a fun place to work. I kind of wish Alyse had gone more in depth on this part, but I can completely understand why she didn't, because it most likely would have been beyond the scope of what she was talking about. So let's talk a little bit about GoldenEye's place in video game history. And it is brought up quite a bit here in this book. But GoldenEye sits at a very interesting point for video games. It was a first-person shooter on a console that isn't really a genre that worked very well for console games. I kind of was thinking back while I was reading this about other first-person shooters that were on home console. None of them were particularly original. You had the Wolfenstein 3D port, you had the Doom port for the Super Nintendo. I don't think there were too many more, but I could be wrong. I think there were other games that used a first-person perspective, but they weren't necessarily like an actual shooter, or what we would see as an FPS now. You then get to the PlayStation, and I remember Disruptor, which was Insomniac's first game that was released. I played that one. It's kind of okay, and then you have a bunch of other PC ports that were brought over. So you have more Dooms, and Doom and Quake, that sort of thing, were brought over to Sega Saturn and PlayStation around that time. But GoldenEye was something different. It actually cared a little bit more about the story. It wasn't just fast action, that sort of thing. And you were doing more than just running around shooting people. You had to do stealth and other stuff. And it kind of showed that you could do a first-person shooter, like an somewhat original first-person shooter idea on a home console, and have it work out really well. It also brought in like the different multiplayer modes and that sort of thing. It brought in a lot that had been done before, but hadn't been kind of I'm not going to say perfected, but had kind of been expanded on. So you didn't see that on the home console very much, and you see a lot of the things that are being done now that were done by Goldeneye. So you see companies kind of building off of what Goldeneye had done all the way back in the late 90s. And it's kind of cool to see all of that stuff. Alyse kind of brings this point, well, she explains the point much better than I have, but she sort of emphasizes this by bringing in quotes from John Romero, where he's talking about what Goldeneye had done, how Goldeneye had kind of advanced the genre, and how it had really made console first-person shooters a little bit more, how do I want to put it? It set up a very good roadmap for people to make first-person shooters. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Overall, it was just a very important game for the time. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say about that. Let's move on to just how the game was made. So the part I really wanted to focus on here was just how the project was really managed. And a lot of this was brought up in hindsight, just how the team didn't really have any project management experience. They didn't really know what they were... They knew what they were doing, they just didn't necessarily know how to do it and how long it was going to take. And there was a lot of iteration that went on here. So the team was really trying to push the boundaries on what the N64 could do, and they spent much of their time just really iterating their design, tweaking things, trying stuff out. If it didn't work out, they would drop it and move on to the next thing. This happens a lot with different technology projects, and you kind of see just how this, especially with video games and with other forms of technology and software, you see how the iterative project management design works, where you get an idea or you get a task, you go into sort of the development phase, like the initial planning phase and how they want to do things. You get a product somewhat done, or at least a version of the product done. You test it to see if it works. If it works, then you you ask for some feedback. When you get feedback, then you kind of modify the design, and it sort of starts this cycle all over again until finally you get it to a point where you at least think it's done. Then you send it off to the customer, you get more feedback, and maybe you'll have to do that whole cycle again. You could also use the term development hell, because it doesn't sound like the people that were working on the game saw it that way, but they kind of spent a lot of time just going around and around in a circle, taking ideas, seeing if it would work. If it didn't, throw it out, try something else. It was kind of fun to read about that, and it was kind of interesting to hear people talk about how they didn't necessarily think it was stressful. They were actually enjoying what they were doing. And I think that had to do with a lot of the pressure not being on them. They had a lot of top cover from their management, which was kind of cool. In this case, it resulted in just an absolutely excellent FPS that really created a lot of what we would expect from a modern FPS on home console. And they were given a lot of freedom and a lot of time to do what they were doing. Then we probably wouldn't, if they didn't get that, we probably wouldn't have seen the version that we have today, which, probably would have been very different. But they bring up like a few of the other things that they were talking about, like some of their inspirations as well, which I'll get into in the next section. This kind of reminds me, when I was reading this, it reminded me of how some like indie developers describe things, and that's brought up kind of in this book. Alyse kind of compares it to that. Some of the dev team compares it to it. And reading this again, like before I got to those sections, yeah, it reminded me of the stories that I had heard of indie game development, or how games were made back in the 80s, where they were just trying to make something fun. Everybody was working as a team. They weren't afraid to try anything new. And, not everything they did worked, but at least they didn't let those things that didn't work stop them from, trying new things. This, honestly, was the part of the book that I found the most interesting. And it was just cool to read how, the game was, originally going to look, which we'll get into, again, once I get into the inspiration section. So this part was really fun, just hearing about the different things that kind of inspired these guys and the different games that they were pulling from. Obviously, you have the usual ones, so they got inspired by Doom, that sort of thing. And that sort of gave them an idea for a first-person perspective and kind of how they wanted to do stuff. But the way it was described earlier, Goldeneye was going to be a rail shooter, which was bizarre for me to kind of hear about, especially knowing what the final product looked like. The rail shooter is a genre of arcade games where the player's kind of ushered through the game. It's a style where you go to a certain spot, stop, and then you kind of shoot enemies as they come at you. Once you've defeated all of them, you're moved along to the next location. So you don't really have the freedom to move around or anything like that. The game that I most associate with this genre was House of the Dead. However, the game they kind of took this idea from was Virtual Cop. Because I think that one was out at this time. I don't exactly know if the original House of the Dead was out. It might have been, but yeah, I don't exactly remember when those two games were released. Both games are just a lot of fun. I love House of the Dead. And they're kind of best played with a light gun controller, which would not have really worked all that well with the N64. I know you could move around the cursor and everything with the analog stick, but yeah, I know how it would work, but no, I think a light gun would have been better. They do talk a lot about the different control schemes and everything that they created for it, and GoldenEye has a lot of different control schemes. I just don't think the rail shooter would have been a good idea, and I'm kind of glad that they dropped it, because that would have been a nightmare. The id Software games are obviously brought up. This is what I thought of when I first started playing GoldenEye. And this is going to date me horribly, but I looked at it and I was like, oh wow, that's a Doom clone. Because that was just sort of the name for FPS back then. Everything was just going to be a clone of Doom. At least that's the way it felt. And it turned out to be, so much more than what Doom was. It was one of the first-person shooters that actually gave a shit about the story and focused more on that than actually, just trying to get you to kill as much stuff with maybe a paragraph of an explanation for what you're doing that you can just kind of ignore because you don't really care about that. But with GoldenEye, they did a lot more. And they actually added stuff into the movie's plot. And when I read that, I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And it sort of made me wonder how many people noticed back in 1997 that there was more in the game than what was in the movie. GoldenEye is one of those games that I don't remember for its single player. I only really ever remember playing it in multiplayer. I'm sure maybe once or twice I tried the single player mode, but I don't remember any of those times. It was just one of those games where we always played every weekend in high school. Until Perfect Dark came out or one of the other games that kind of took its place. But yeah, the thing I remember most about it is just being absolutely terrible at the game. I was awful at it, and I got really, really sick of the game. Eventually, I really ended up hating GoldenEye for a while. I never owned an N64 growing up, so when I would go over to my friends' houses to play video games on the weekend, they would all want to play Goldeneye. All of them owned an N64, all of them owned Goldeneye. They were all way better at it. They memorized everything about the multiplayer. You know, like if you killed somebody in a certain spot, they knew where you were going to spawn. And I didn't know any of that stuff. I was just sort of fumbling around, getting killed constantly, terrible at aiming, just absolutely awful at the game. And yeah, they would honestly start asking, you know, why are you so bad at this? And it wasn't even trash talk. Like, they really wanted to know why I sucked at it. Now I think it's kind of funny. At the time, I was just sort of like, why are we still playing this, and why am I still playing it? It got to the point where I was such a hindrance to the team that I was on that I would die and then just set the controller down and be like, okay, we're good. I can't possibly harm our team anymore now. I've already lost once. I'm just going to put the controller down and never come back into it. Looking at the game now, it's a very impressive game that they crammed a lot into, especially since it was on a cartridge. Like, it's kind of crazy to see how much is really in this game. There's a lot of revisionist history about the N64. The internet seems to have created some kind of odd ideas about the system, and the truth is somewhere in between. You know, the truth about it is somewhere in between. It's nowhere near, the controller's nowhere near as bad as what many people on the internet pointed out to be. And the console is nowhere near as great as everybody seems to remember it being. It has a very small library when you look at it. And there's a lot of shovelware on that system. And, you know, it's... How can I put this? There's a lot of just crap on the system. Not necessarily bad games, but games that are just sort of not really worth the money that they were charging for them. And even now, they're not really worth that much. They shouldn't be worth that much money. You have, out of the, I think it's close to 400 games. Out of those 400 games, you probably have 100 that are just really, really good. Like games that you would want to go out and play. And then you have probably 50 that are okay games that, you know, there's something that you can pick up and people can enjoy, and you know they might be like a hidden gem or something. And then you've got just a whole bunch of racing and sports titles that are just copy and pasted and slapped together and aren't really all that great. Some of them could be, but for the most part it's just the same shit that you've played over and over again. That's kind of what I remember the most about this thing, is Goldeneye being one of those games that I liked now. I didn't like it back when it first came out. I can see what people were going for and just how great the game really was. I will always remember this, not really for the game, but for just sort of the experience of going over to people's houses and playing this with them. You know, just getting off of work when I used to work at Little Caesars, making a bunch of pizzas, taking them over to my friend's house, and then just spending the whole night eating pizza and laughing at each other as we play like the different things that you could do with Goldeneye. Not just the multiplayer, but like some of the different stuff that was possible, like switching over to the man with the golden gun, trying to kill that guy, or just doing like the slap fighting and everything like that. It's just a lot of fun memories from a time that probably is not really going to come back unless some of my friends and I are all happen to be in the same city at the same time, which seems like it doesn't really happen anymore. So, final thoughts on this. This might bleed into the memories a little bit, but while I was reading this, I just kept thinking back to going over to my friend's house, specifically going over to my friend Alex's house and playing it in his garage, which was always weird. We would usually do that during the summer, and then during the winter we would go over to Drew's house because his parents were just never home. It was really weird. And yeah, I would bring over pizza, and we would just spend the whole night playing games, eating pizza, and just having fun. It helped that there were just four of us. We had other friends, but for some weird reason, it was just the four of us that always seemed to get together. Once the Xbox came out and you could actually like link consoles together and everything, then more people started showing up. But it was usually just weird if you had like that fifth person who was just waiting to play or something like that. It was very strange the way things worked out. And yeah, over time, I've kind of changed my mind on Goldeneye. I went from enjoying it at first to hating it quickly, just because it was like, can we please play something else besides this game that I'm awful at and you guys keep, just brutally murdering me, to kind of respecting what they did, what the development team did, and just seeing the achievement that they had made with it. And going back and playing it after I read this book, it was kind of fun to go back and play it. And I'm still terrible at it, but whatever. There are more stories in this book. I didn't really want to tell them all here, but I do think a lot of them are very interesting. And Alyse did a great job of really sort of laying everything out and explaining everything. It's just a really great book, and it's pretty much what I've come to expect from boss fight books. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.